So you may recognize this family from Billawheeler, and this is an example of the implications of the Convention relating to the status of refugees from 1951 and the Protocol relating to the status of refugees from 1967. So both of these, this convention and the protocol provide provisions to protect and support refugees. The purpose was to identify the conditions in which a person would be considered a refugee. So what is the definition of a refugee? And then providing legal rights, recognizing that people have the right to seek asylum from persecution in other countries. So, so here through these pieces of these treaties, we understand what a refugee is and what their rights are. So this family from Billawheeler were originally assessed not to be refugees in Australia. And this was the argument that was used by politicians to support their claims that Australia did not owe the family protection. But ultimately, back in 2021, when the Labor government got into power, one of their promises was to allow this family to stay in Australia, and they upheld that promise. So this family is now still living in Billawheeler in Queensland. But you can see how these different treaties and what they say about the rights of people do play a role in political decisions and certainly in the way that refugees and their situations are handled. So, a little bit more of an overview of each of these. So, the 1951 Convention elaborates on Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, as I mentioned before, we do have overlaps between different treaties, protocols, conventions, all of the different words we can use to describe them. So the Universal Declaration is quite broad. It's covering lots of different areas and lots of different rights. And then we do have all of these more specific treaties as well. So in this case, we've got the 1951 Convention that's elaborating on those more general principles set out in Article 13 of the UN Declaration. So it includes the core principle of non-refoulement. So that means that a refugee should not be returned to a country, so sent back to a country where they face serious threats to their life or their freedom. It also includes the provision that arbitrary detainment is illegal and penalties are not to be awarded based on illegal entry. So if a refugee illegally enters a country, they can't be penalized because of that. And it also includes the provision of public education in Article 22. So refugees have that right to receive an education in the country that they're in. The 1967 Protocol broadens the applicability of the 1951 Convention, and it also removes the geographical and time limits that were part of the 1951 Convention. So there were different limitations there, and years later in 67 they recognized those limitations and that they shouldn't be there, so those were able to be removed as well. The International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. This was from 1966, and it requires that racial segregation, criminalization of incitement of racial hatred, and promotes understanding and tolerance. So, so they want to get rid of racial discrimination and segregation in society. They are saying that inciting racial hatred is a criminal offense, and it's also saying that they want to promote understanding and tolerance in society, so we can all be united regardless of our race. Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination Against Women. You can see that different groups of people who are minority groups or have faced discrimination in the past, and in some cases continue to face discrimination, tend to have dedicated conventions relating to eliminating discrimination against them, because over the years it's been recognized that they have discrimination against them, that they are minority groups. So those pieces of human rights legislation have come in to try and help with that. So in this case, the Convention on the Discrimination Against Women outlines all the non-discrimination requirements and also women's rights. So regarding a whole bunch of different areas like political life, representation, and rights to nationality, education, employment, and health. So some main features: the idea of substantive equality, non-discrimination, and state obligation. So let's have a look at what these things mean. So substantive gender equality requires that equality is interpreted according to the broad context or the realities of women's disadvantages and the impact that their circumstances have in terms of eliminating disadvantage. So it's not easy to just compare different groups. It's not straightforward to compare different groups. So this is saying that we need to look at the disadvantage that women in particular face and make sure that this idea of equality is looked at from that broader context to make sure that those disadvantages are factored in. State obligation is the concept that a state that is party to the convention is legally obligated to take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women and advance gender equality. So it's the obligation of all of the different states that are signing up to this convention. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, 1991. We mentioned the rights of children earlier, so we'll have a bit more of a detailed look here. So the main feature of this convention is non-discrimination, which is all about this idea that children have rights regardless of who they are. So regardless of race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national, ethnic, or social origin, property, disability, birth, or other status. So there's heaps of different things that that make each person unique, each child unique, and none of them should be used as something that children are that is held against children. So children should not be discriminated against based on any of these things, and indeed no one should be, because it doesn't matter what these things are for a person. It doesn't matter what our background is. We should all be treated equally. We should all have the same human rights under the law. So children's rights in the convention include the right to be treated fairly, to have a say about decisions affecting them. And that's something that's really important because often it's this case of children not having the knowledge and the maturity to be able to make decisions by themselves. And often it's adults making decisions on their behalf. But this convention is recognizing that they should actually have a say about the decisions that affect them because ultimately it is about them and they are still people. They also have the right to live and grow up healthy, to be safe no matter where they are. They have a right to an education and the right to play and have fun. So, another feature is this idea of the devotion to the best interests of the child. So, the child's best interests must be the primary consideration whenever we're making decisions about children or affecting the child. So, so when we hear about different legal cases in society, we hear about how uh, this decision was in the best interests of the child. That could be from different perspectives. It could be the safety of the child, the health of the child. It could be from an education perspective, um, a financial perspective, all of those different considerations that may play a part in what's in their best interest. So, respect for the views of the child. So, this is the idea that children have the right to express themselves freely on matters that affect them and to have their views taken seriously. So, yes, they are children. They haven't reached that 18-year mark, but they still have opinions. They still have the right to express those views and to to not be treated as lesser than or to not be treated as though those opinions that they have aren't valuable. Um, they also have the right to life, survival, and development. So there's some very basic ones that would be covered in other documents. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the ICCPR are also covering the right to life. And then we have, for all of these specific conventions for the different groups like women, children, etc., we often have some overlaps, but then also some building on those more general principles, some more specific things that relate to that particular group or that particular issue. So in Australia, in terms of children's rights, we don't have the Convention on the Rights of the Child embedded in our domestic legislative framework. So we do have some child rights issues. We've got this idea of the age of criminal responsibility. So children as young as 10 can be arrested and jailed, and the UN has called for this age to be raised to 14. So when we aren't embedding different legislation, that means that we don't need to follow uh, the convention because we haven't ratified it yet. And in this case, that means that Australia is able to not follow what the UN believes is the right path to follow. Another aspect is child labour. So you must be 15 years old to enter into labour practices. There are some exceptions to this, like in the entertainment industry, you might be doing work there with acting or things like that and be below 15, but that's a general rule. And the right to get an education as well. So school is mandatory for 6 to 17-year-olds. There are, of course, exceptions to that as well. Some students choose to leave school early, but they have to have a job. There are certain requirements there. Have to have a job or have to have another path that they're taking with education, for example.